So we have a special guest speaker today, India Vakil. India Vakil is the CEO and founder of Resolink and is a recognized thought leader in the area of supply chain risk management from companies like Cisco and Flex. She's created, she's credited with bringing SCRM solutions or supply chain risk management solutions into the mainstream. Since founding Resolink in 2010, she holds the patent for evaluating supply chain vulnerability and risk across the enterprise. She also is the founder of the Global Supply Chain Risk Resiliency Council, a nonprofit dedicated to advancing the discipline of supply chain risk management. She's on the advisory board of MIT Center for Transportation and Logistics. Ms. Vakil holds a master's degree in supply chain management from MIT and an MBA in finance. We'd like to welcome Bindia Vakil at this time. Hello, Bindia.
Hey, Jigger. Thank you for having me at this session, and thank you all for attending. It's a tough time for all of us, unprecedented event for a supply chain practitioner. Yes, we deal with supply chain disruptions on a daily basis. There's a factory fire here, there's a supplier disruption there. What we're getting hit with today is something unprecedented. It is coming at us from every direction, supply side, demand side, suppliers, sub-tiers, our contract manufacturers, and our own factories, and employees as well in some cases are disrupted. So today what we'll go through is just kind of talk about the numbers a little bit. And then we'll present, as many of you know, Resolink is the supply chain mapping company. We have been working for the last decade, building transparency, trust, and collaboration between our customers and their global suppliers, with over 350,000 sites mapped, over 3 million parts mapped to sites around the world. We have a very unique perspective on the global supply chain that touches many, many industries that are key to what the products we use on a daily basis. So we'll talk about the different countries that are currently impacted and where we see the impact going over the next couple of months. Finally, we'll talk about just what people are doing as we speak and some outlook and advice for planning over the next few months. So as we all know, we won't spend a lot of time. I think by now we are all fairly educated on coronavirus. This information is, from a reference standpoint, it's provided and for your benefit. But really what we are dealing with, as I said, is quite unprecedented because this is a very contagious infection. Lots of people are getting infected. Community outbreaks are being seen in multiple areas. And as a result, we're seeing tremendous amount of concern right now in communities, with governments, and certainly media. Just for your reference here, we have provided just some, there's a lot of question right now about what are the various phases. The pandemic, is it a pandemic or is it not a pandemic? So just for your reference here, again, we're providing just the phases of how the World Health Organization classifies the phases of a pandemic. Over the past few years, the World Health Organization has not really has been saying that they are not classifying something as a pandemic. They are letting the world use that phrase colloquially. But what we're seeing is that typically a pandemic is something that really occurs over a very wide area, crossing many international boundaries, and it usually affects a large number of people. And so we really see pandemics as being something that we have identified by their geographic scale, and they have the tendency to cause significant economic, social, and political upheaval. So that's really the spark risk, the spread risk. The spark risk being how likely is it to happen. The spread risk is how likely is it to diffuse broadly through the population. Over the last few weeks, we are starting to see outbreaks in many different countries as well as communities. And so the next few weeks, we are all kind of waiting for the World Health Organization to provide their official outlook. But the reality for supply chain people is that it really it's designations, and yes, designations matter, but we're already dealing with this event from a supply chain perspective. This has already been highly disruptive to all of us. And this was something we actually presented way back on January 24th, which is when we first did the ResLink first webinar to our customers. We presented this and we talked about how we saw this progressing. And unfortunately, many of these things are happening as we speak. Over the last few weeks, the coverage of the outbreak is highly magnified. We're seeing almost 1.9 trillion coronavirus-related articles on the internet. And this has brought the fear factor in people. We're based here in Silicon Valley. We have about 60 and growing cases, and already a lot of people are very nervous about going to work. And companies like Twitter have publicly announced that they've asked their employees to work from home. Personally speaking, the traffic is definitely a lot reduced, so it's not just larger companies across the Bay Area. We see that people are nervous. So think about it. This is what we're seeing in a community with about 60, 70 cases. Now magnify it to countries where we're seeing 5,000 cases, in China where we're seeing 80,000 plus cases, and think about the people and the nervousness and the fear factor there. Put yourself in those communities and think about how effectively can those communities resume operations, bring sites back up, get employees comfortable about sending children to school or showing up at work. And now you can see how supply chains are so much more disrupted than we may be thinking, in our minds or reading in the news. A lot of times people talk about, oh yeah, we're bringing factories back up. But the reality is what we're seeing is companies may be restarting, quote unquote, but they are not filled with people. And you need people to run factories. You need people to write documentation that you can use for your export processing. You need people to support your loading and unloading of ships. People run supply chains today, and we are, as people, we are very nervous. I want to just say that containment measures are essential because containment, if the virus spreads broadly, then it puts a portion of our communities at risk. And those people who are older or have some pre-existing medical conditions, they're particularly at risk here of developing severe or critical symptoms. And so let's look at the demographics of the Western world, and certainly some countries like Japan as well, where we have an aging demographic. And so it's really critical that companies, countries, individuals, and organizations all invest to the extent possible in containment measures. However, the greater the containment, quarantines, and lockdowns, unfortunately, they are necessary for our humanitarian protection, but they are highly disruptive to supply chains and to any economic activity. So we have been compiling a lot of information over the last few 2 months from news, interviews, sources in public domain. We picked up and notified on this, and the very first article came out that there was a cluster of pattern of unknown pneumonia happening in China, and drew the first war room on Wuhan. And since then, we have seen this chart get yellower and redder, I would say. And by March, we feel like if the shutdowns and quarantines expand, then more and more we will start to see supply chain experts start to experience all of the things here. A lot of focus is on automotive. We will not be talking too much about automotive today, and here's why. There is an over-inventory issue in automotive at the front of finished goods side is what we are finding in public domain. In China alone, their factories have the capacity to make over 60 million vehicles a year, but only 1/3 of them are sold. And so yes, there's a supply chain disruption. Here in the US, what we found in public domain again is that there is a 70-day supply of new vehicles, and some of the older models have not yet been sold. And so yes, there is a supply chain disruption, we understand, but as of today, we still see that there's finished goods inventory that should give automotive industry some relief, so we'll not talk about that industry. Across the other verticals, we are seeing more companies slowly start bringing operations, but employees are not back. In some cases, not even back to 50%. In fact, a few days ago, Bloomberg reported only 30% of companies had managed to resume production in the China regions of impact and lockdown. We also see that some companies have tried to hire temporary workers, but we all know the reality is factories require skilled workers for at least a portion of their operations. And so many companies do report this as being a key bottleneck. ResLink has surveyed over 1,000 companies as well. So a lot of what we are reporting out on today is just compiled across sources in public domain and verified by the suppliers and companies who have responded to the survey. What we are finding from those responses that two issues are frequently causing problems. Many companies reported that their supplier assessments today are not yet complete or clear. They have very little visibility to some of their suppliers' current status and almost no visibility to their secondary suppliers. So of course, there is a lot of uncertainty about the supplier's ability to support them. And most companies that we hear from are trying to build this picture as we speak and get more clarity on that. The second issue is that even if factories have come back and returned to operation, transportation disruptions continue. We have seen instances of products that arrive at the loading dock but are delayed because of workers are not there. Shipments are disrupted because of insufficient or inaccurate documentation, so countries will not let it in. Again, because companies are operating with a skeleton crew at the shipper's site, and maybe some people are sort of not trained and they're filling in for someone else who's not there. And so these are all the practical realities of disruptions that we are seeing. A third thing is very interesting is that companies who are able to have finished goods, have parts, have managed to get them transported, are finding that their customer sites are disrupted. And so the customers are unable to accept shipments. So what we're expecting is that should the lockdown and quarantines that are currently in place in China and South Korea continue through end of March or even be expanded, then we will see that, you know, a lot of companies that had finished goods inventories over the last few weeks, we will see those dwindle. By the end of March, we will begin to see allocations. Some companies and some industries, we've already started seeing allocations, but starting April, we do expect more companies to manage, have supplier allocations, and in some cases, they will put their own customers on allocation as well. Now, allocation is an interesting thing, scary thing actually, because when allocations happen, what we worry about is that some companies will inflate demand so that they can try to get a higher share. And in the next few months, especially as the demand picture goes and becomes we have more clarity, we see this being a possible outcome, and this can distort the demand flow. So right now, what we are seeing is that demand is dropping. As the demand goes up, that inflation of demand can happen. And that can create an artificial bullwhip effect that sort of ripples through the supply chain. And so the companies that are at the end of the line will probably see wild swings in demand, first going down and then completely going up again very quickly, as each layer in that chain tries to not only recover their constrained supply, but also get sufficient inventory to replenish buffers at every stage. Now, based on the level of disruption, based on how widespread the disruption is across the regions of Asia that are strategic for the global supply chain for many companies and industries, we have been advising our customers to plan to be disrupted for at least another 6 months. And even then, we don't know what the new normal is. When we say disrupted, we mean we are disrupted until we get back to normal, but you all know normal itself has shifted. So we don't know, as of now, there's not enough information. We should start to see more information get available within the next 3 to 4 months. I talked quite a lot already about China, but over the next few months, what we will see is that, China labor disruptions are expected to continue. For those of us who have worked with China for many years, we have already, unfortunately, had to deal with this in 2016 when China had a lot of large infrastructure projects in the interior parts of the country. And so when Chinese New Year, over Chinese New Year, when people went back home, a lot of them found jobs close to families, and so they did not come back.
And what we experienced was that a lot of people went back and did not return, and it was for months we were very disrupted, and many companies and suppliers could not run at full capacity. So now we're looking at something similar. We expect that a large portion of the workforce in the affected areas is likely to be permanently displaced, as well as, people will find more lucrative jobs sometimes with larger companies that are really struggling to hire and may end up paying big premiums. In the medium term, we expect many companies will have to go through retraining and ramp up. So on the supplier side, you might see a lot of disruption where there's performance gaps, new employees that are being ramped up, and some smaller companies will really hurt because they'll have lost sales. They might have, to compete with a more expensive workforce in some cases. And so they might really struggle to get back online. On the logistics side, obviously, a lot of just-in-time supply chains are already under a lot of stress. Cargo volumes have already dropped by 20% or more in the first quarter. And we're seeing that some of the revenue is lost revenue. We won't see that recover. So it'll be an interesting few months for all of us. There are some near-term, I guess, things like low fuel costs. So on the near term, some shipping costs have gone up for many people because they're air freighting things where they can instead of ocean. And low fuel costs certainly will help with that. But as we go through the recovery in the next few months, there will be demand for higher capacity from the transportation companies on certain key lanes that are currently disrupted. So it is possible that it may affect other lanes, because it's possible they may try to reduce capacity on less profitable lanes and add it on the higher profitability, high demand lanes. So we are generally expecting this is one key reason why we do expect disruptions to continue into and well past the next 4 to 6 months. This is a key question for many people on top of mind. A lot of times we think, we have insurance, right? It covers our financial losses, and insurance generally covers financial losses like lost profits when you pay premiums to expedite freight, raw material premiums that you might pay, any emergency labor cost that you might pay, etc. Or you might have cash burn during a factory going down, and finally, in some cases, revenue loss. But the one problem with this is that property policies generally cover only physical loss or physical damage to insured property that arises from a covered risk. This is a key problem for anybody who is thinking that your insurance will cover you. You need to go figure out if your property policy only covers you for physical damage. And physical damage means the site is damaged in an earthquake or hurricane, or like there's some physical damage. In the case of employees staying at home or unable to come to work, even because government made them stay home, that is not physical damage. Okay, so your property policy might not actually get triggered or be covered. So your losses might not be covered by insurance. A lot of people in supply chain and treasury work on contingent business interruption insurance. Tens of millions of dollars are paid in insurance premium. Coverage also here requires direct physical damage to the property of a named company site. So if you have not mapped your supply chain and you don't know where your second tier or third tier supplier is and they get disrupted, and as a result a covered site gets disrupted, then even in an earthquake hurricane type situation, a lot of times you're not covered because your named site was not disrupted. Now, in this case, same thing as above, no physical damage, likely not covered. The only thing is if you have trade disruption insurance, and trade disruption insurance can sometimes cover potential losses incurred because of loss of earnings or extra expenses or contractual penalties because of delays or disruptions in trade flows, which may provide some level of protection. And so that is something to kind of explore. Small company distress right now, we see a kind of a reverse bullwhip at this time. As I talked about, when the OEM sees a 2% drop in demand, a company in somewhere far away might, in the supply chain 3-4 tiers deep, might see a 50% or 70% drop in demand. So this is currently what we are very concerned about. And at the third tier level, fourth tier level, your supply chain has those small players. There was an interesting article in Bloomberg. It was a survey of over 6,400 companies where they talked about how many months of cash companies have, and it's about 65% of small companies in China reported they have 2 months of cash, and we're already 5 weeks into that. Obviously, we do expect that there will be some level of government subsidization, some relief on debt, etc., that the government of China and certainly other countries around the world will enact some kind of bailout packages, if you will. But having said that, if what we've told our customers is plan for that. Work with your supplier monitoring, financial monitoring tools and providers. Keep a close eye on the privately held small companies. Ensure you calculate the revenue impact. We always look at spend, but it's going to be the small suppliers who we don't spend a lot of money with, but we buy something single source that we said, oh, we'll get around to dual sourcing someday. And that is those are the suppliers where we see the most risk. So we have seen this in the past. We've lived through 2008 and 2009, and here are some things companies ended up having to do. They had to prop up with some weak suppliers who were very critical. The way you think about who do I prop up with cash and help them through the difficult time is you would do that for a supplier who's highly critical for your revenue. So if you have a supplier, you spend $500,000 with them, but their impact, if they're not around, that impacts $2 billion of your revenue. Here's a supplier that you need to be very careful of because that is a critical strategic player, and you may need to set aside either some emergency funding for them, or second, what we did in the past with some suppliers in my past life in procurement was we placed lifetime buy. And actually that brought the supplier out of bankruptcy, because what orders we would have placed over a 3-4 year period, we placed over a 3-month period, and we got them, to ramp up their supply lines for us, keep them open, and they actually emerged out of bankruptcy and had a very successful 10 years before they got acquired at a very high valuation. So just, you know, this is a critical time. These are the times when your suppliers who have been transparent with you, where they shared transparently shared their financial statements, months of cash, etc., with your software providers or data collectors or your supplier financial risk assessment teams. Don't use it as a punitive measure, rather use it to work collaboratively to help them through very difficult times. So with that, we'll shift a little to talk about the supply chain dependencies in countries in Asia. Now, our data shows that over 50% of manufacturing output, and actually even the Reslink sites that we have mapped, 50% of them come from the countries in Asia that are really critical to the global supply chain and that are also currently in the regions of impact. So those would be Japan, South Korea, China, Taiwan, right? So these are countries that are very critical. And then many countries and many companies, looked at Vietnam as an emerging country to move manufacturing for taking advantage of low manufacturing cost of labor after the trade tariff. But right now we are starting to see some disruptions there as well. And then in general, just what, so sorry, there is a typo here. This is actually 11% disrupted in South Korea. Out of all of the sites in South Korea, about 11% are currently disrupted. And in China, 10.8% out of all the sites that we have mapped are currently disrupted. In Japan, there are schools closed all over the country. And as we've talked before in these webinars, when schools close, people stay home to take care of kids. And so even if the factory is fine and up and running, they can't operate at 100% capacity. Wuhan, so in the subsequent slides, we'll just kind of go through a few critical regions of the world and just kind of talk about the different sites and industries that are affected. Starting with Wuhan. So we've presented this a few weeks ago as well, actually January 24th, where we talked about how critical the region around Wuhan is to the electronics industry and also to the automotive industry. A lot of sites are based in this area, and specifically for the high-tech sector, not only across Wuhan, but across all the impacted regions of China, we see that more than 9,000 sites are in the quarantine zones, and 36,000 parts are mapped to the impacted areas that are either under lockdown or quarantine as we speak. And it's a wide range of industries that are buying parts or have sites in these areas. If we look at the components that come from China overall, there are very small things like capacitors, resistors. I mean, if you look at some of the components on this list or categories on this list, what's really scary is that these aren't the expensive things, you know, that you would have in a product, in a typical high-tech or consumer electronics product. These are the things that you don't think about. These are the penny or less than a penny cost parts. The good news is a lot of these parts can be dual or multi-source. Unfortunately, the bad news is a lot of the companies that you would buy these parts from do come from China because they are very inexpensive. Again, another good news is companies do tend to hold a lot of inventory because the inventory doesn't have, you know, it neither takes up a lot of space, nor is it very expensive. Having said that, you use hundreds of these. And so even if one of the parts is disrupted because you had not put it on dual sourcing, or there was some specific type of capacitor or resistor that you needed to use on your product, Now you have an inexpensive part, which is going on very long lead time that could bring down tens of $1,000 product. And that's what we are very worried about right now. I started my career in supply chain with a 1-year lead time on a tantalum capacitor. And that was not even like 0.1 cent was the cost of that capacitor. But we were seeing inflated demands from all companies. And I used to be in the contract manufacturing industry. And everybody who bought, whom we made products for, were inflating their demand to us because it was such an allocated item that if they needed 2,000, they were telling us they needed 10,000. Not only that, they were not only telling us they needed 10,000, they were telling all their other contract manufacturers as well that they all need 10,000. So it's parts like this that are always very scary because people can actually afford to buy a lot more of them when they're disrupted because they're not the expensive ones. But for risk, and this is what we've been saying for the last decade, is that it's not spend, it is risk, which means every part on the BOM is important. You can't ship the product without a label. You can't ship it without its box or instruction sheet, or if one connector is missing. So your whole iPhone could be done, and if the cable isn't there, you can't ship that. So this is what we are currently dealing with. This is just a quick, across China, I know we talk about quarantine and lockdown areas, but we know that the disruptions are widespread, not only because of the quarantine areas, but quarantine areas are suppliers to the areas that aren't under quarantine. And so this is the two things we want to talk about is this is all the stuff China exports to the rest of the world. And there's a drop in ocean traffic. The suppliers to the factories that are open and functioning and able to transit products in and out are disrupted, and transportation as well is highly disrupted. So shifting to South Korea really quickly now. We have mapped over 2,000 parts to, so if you look at, before I go to parts, if you look at this top left chart, it shows you the affected areas in South Korea. If you look at this, is a screenshot of the ResLink sites that shows the site concentration, which is literally over those affected areas. So this is what we are currently concerned about. And there are several thousand parts mapped, more than 1,000 sites that are in South Korea. And as you'll see in the next two slides, the picture becomes a little more grim. A lot of tier 2, tier 3 vendors, actually, before I go there, I just want to say a disruption in South Korea will create massive near-term disruptions. The closer you are to the stuff you buy in South Korea. And the reality is if you're a high-tech company or an automotive company, you're buying things in your second and third and fourth tier supply chain, things that come out of South Korea. You may have a wafer fabrication site in Taiwan. Your wafer goes to South Korea for processing and packaging, and then it goes to factories in China like Foxconn, Jabil, etc. around the world. But South Korea is a very key hub for manufacturing for electronics. Again, a good news, bad news. The good news is that if you have a assembly test site, then alternate sites are available that are outside of Korea. And when ResLink does our mapping, one of the questions we ask suppliers is, hey, if your primary site goes down, how long where do you have an alternate? And if you have an alternate, tell us where it is and how quickly you can start shipping from the alternate. And typically what we see is that the companies will say on the wafer fabrication, we see 90% of the time they have no alternate. On the assembly test site, which is happening in South Korea, they do have alternates that are outside Korea, but the alternates can be brought up within 10 weeks. So that's the good news. Unfortunately, the bad news is there is limited capacity. So it's not like the alternate site's sitting there twiddling its thumbs waiting for demand. No, they're also busy supporting customers. And so what we see is that if, yes, it can happen where you can revert to an alternate if you have one or two customers who are disrupted in a disruption, but in a wide scale thing like this, it's either first come, first serve, or you're looking at a long allocation period. Also, this is an interesting perspective that ResLink has on the world. Because we do supply chain mapping for many tiers, we see a lot of these subcontractors like ASE, Amcor, SAS, Chippak, Spill, etc., that are in South Korea. But there are also a lot of key component suppliers that are very, very widely used across many components that have one of their regions where they have manufacturing is South Korea. This is not to say all of their manufacturing sites are in South Korea. We are not saying that, but a lot of these companies on this list have some manufacturing presence in South Korea, and they are very widely used across the high-tech supply chain. So again, because they have disruptions in some of their sites, it is possible that other sites may be disrupted either because customers are clamoring for some capacity at the alternate, etc. But we do see that because so many companies use these same suppliers over and over again, that they are kind of in one of those bottlenecks in that sub-tier supply chain, and really critical companies actually in the sub-tier supply chain for electronics industry. At the category level, South Korea exports pretty much every component that you can imagine that goes into a typical high-tech product. Obviously, the electricals, caps, resistors, magnetics, packaging boxes, thermal power, all kinds of, and of course, ICs. Which are a big portion of their exports. And it's interesting because the supply chain is so interconnected between Taiwan, Japan, South Korea. You see Taiwan ships to South Korea, which does the packaging, ships to China. The same thing happens. South Korea imports things from Japan, processes it, and ships it back and forth. So there's a lot of interconnection happening between these 8 countries in Asia. They all are counting on an uninterrupted supply chain in order to kind of do the back and forth of these components on a daily basis. The rest of Asia, we see very critical as well. And this is definitely affecting many companies, not just the key that we focused on today. For instance, India, which is a major hub for pharmaceutical industry, their local media reported that a lot of the ingredients that Indian pharma manufacturers buy, they come from regions that are disrupted, China and others. And certainly now we'll talk about Italy in a couple of minutes as well. But India announced that they are restricting exporting about 26 pharmaceutical ingredients because they're worried about fulfilling demand within the country. I talked about Vietnam. Vietnam has a area under lockdown because certain cases have Son Loi commune is under lockdown because a lot of cases have been reported there. People have been asked not to leave and self-quarantine for 20 days. 300 or so companies operating in Vietnam have reported they have suspended operations. And the government has also asked companies to prepare for this escalating further. And they have indicated, the government has indicated they might take further preventive measures. As I said, Vietnam is a selected kind of destination as a low-cost manufacturing hub, but many companies have relocated manufacturing to Vietnam. Their suppliers are still in China or South Korea or whatever. So there, again, lots of interconnections and interchange happening between Vietnam and these other countries. And it is expected that suppliers there could go lines down in the next 4 weeks. Vietnamese companies have already reported that they are seeing their inventory reserves declining and they are having difficulty sourcing. Outside of Asia, we're seeing alarm bells ringing because of demand drops to those upstream suppliers. TIPS in South Africa actually warned that the country's mining industry could suffer significant losses. 86% of South Africa's export to China is raw materials from mining. This includes things like iron ore, manganese, chromium, ferrocium, blah, blah, lots of different things, which, you know, we've obviously reported on through our Event Watch monitoring service. And then many small companies that are in South Korea that sort of are incidental supporting these, they are also expecting to suffer substantial losses, closures, layoffs, and things like that. And this is a little bit of that reverse bullwhip where I talked about, you know, that a small drop in demand here can have a whiplash effect. When you look all the way down to the mining supplier, they are seeing a sudden and complete drop. Shifting focus again to Italy, you can see that at the top left here on the map, you can see the areas of Italy that are affected. Overlay that to the ResLink database where we have supplier sites mapped and concentrated. All the red spots are over the affected areas. So unfortunately, all of the hotspots are manufacturing locations or industrial estates. And there's a almost complete overlap. ResLink has mapped over 1,750 sites. This is about 5% of the total sites. The government has ordered restrictions on all public meetings, cultural, etc., until Sunday the 8th. And many airlines have reduced or canceled routes. Some flight travel restrictions have been placed into effect, and 100,000 people have been quarantined. Italy is actually also very strategically important to the global supply chain. We see appliances, we see automotive, life science, pharma. Actually, as you see, you know, when we looked at the industry picture in the slides so far, we really focused a lot on the high-tech semiconductor. That is a huge hub for those in Asia. When we look at Europe, when we see cases in Italy, we start worrying about life science pharma companies because there are a lot of things that come out of Italy. Serums, medical serums, lots of different chemicals and materials that they make are very critical to the life science industry. There are vaccines, plastics, for the ladies on the call, makeup, polyacetals, some rubber tires, cleaning products, and of course, cars, automotive modules. And Italy, of course, is a huge demand generator because of its tourism industry as well. And that is really, really suffering at this time. For all of us, we have heard extensively about N95, masks, respirators, and PPEs. We have been monitoring this as well. ResLink has a lot of data, of course, because we do a lot of this mapping. We know who the top vendors are that are mask manufacturers, where their global sites are, as well as to some extent, what is the supply chain that supplies into those companies. So what is now expected is that around 89 million masks, 76 million gloves, and 1.6 million pairs of goggles are estimated to be required by healthcare workers. The cost of the N95 respirators has actually tripled in cost, and protective gowns are now twice the prices. So this is a really critical shortage. So if you're worried about this, then you're not alone. And we have a lot of data, obviously, in our system that we track across our customer base. So, well, like I said before, the CDC has said there are no specific treatments for coronaviruses. Most people are expected to recover with mild symptoms. We'll actually show you in the next few slides a study that was done where in China, where they did a really in-depth analysis of over 44,000 cases. And we'll talk about what they found there. Just a quick picture. This has been something that I think we're running literally 24/7. So the Johns Hopkins team that has helped put this together, I think they've done a really good service for all of us worldwide to help us track this as it moves. What we're seeing, and we have been reporting this also since January 24th, when we first put this out, we notified our customers that if we see that this is similar to H1N1, where the recovery numbers are sustained better and positive, then this is a 3 to 6 month disruption, which is what we saw with swine flu pandemic as well. We are kind of looking right now because of the spread and if you notice, the initial fatality rate was 2.2%, and right now it's kind of a little bit higher. So we're kind of in between the mid case and the worst case at this time. We're not really tracking to best case. So that's why we're definitely expecting that we're high to severe in the near to medium term. Looking at the recovery data, this is really what we see is the key early indicator. If we start to see recovery, people who are sick recover and get better across the world. There's a lot of, the inherent distrust with the data that comes out of China. Having said that, I will say that in today's world, it is a little bit harder to contain news and suppress as it was before. Even with coronavirus, we did see a whistleblower notify the world and alert people about the pneumonia cases. So with that said, what I'll say is that there was a study that was done where they analyzed a lot of cases, about 72,000 patient records, and the fatality rate of 2.2% was calculated on the 44,000 confirmed cases. As you can see, 81% of the 44,000 people were actually mild cases, and then there were a subsequent number of 16 or so, I think, percent were severe, and then critical 3%, and then about 1,000 people passed on. So you can see that there were suspected, clinically diagnosed, and asymptomatic cases that were not used to generate the 2.2 number, which is the correct methodology to do it, because of course it has to be based on confirmed cases. What we're just saying is that as we go through and see the 2.2 or 3.4% rates, we have to sort of take into account that there are a lot of mild cases where people may not even be going to the doctor. A lot of companies have not looked at their pandemic plans for many years. So now is a good time to basically create this as a playbook for the future. Don't let all the work you're doing go to waste. Yes, you may have scrambled in the first few weeks because you didn't have a plan, or you didn't have the expertise, you didn't have it tested, but you have gone through and done all of that. So make sure you document it in a system somewhere so that this becomes an asset for your organization in future. A lot of us don't focus on dual or multi-sourcing, and practical reality is we can't. So ResLink does recommend that at least have a monitoring and mapping program for all your suppliers, and mapping for at least your suppliers in the high revenue impact quadrant that are single sourced. I won't dwell on this. We've kind of talked about it. Right now, what we're seeing is that most companies are really in those war rooms, connecting the dots, pooling across many tools, many data systems, and really working collaboratively to develop plans. We're at the center of this, working side by side with our customers, providing them with analysis, data, our research, planning scenarios, etc., to help them get through what is an unprecedented event for all of our careers. With that, just a quick word, heartfelt sympathies for the people in Wuhan, all of China, South Korea, Italy, and all over the world where we see these outbreaks, whether directly or indirectly affected. Keep going, stay strong, and let's emerge out of this. And with that, if we have time, Jigar, I'll take a few questions.
That was great, Bindia. Thank you for that insightful presentation and feedback. One of the things that I'm getting from a question from our audience is, how is this different from past outbreaks?
Yeah, so as I said, we we won't talk about SARS and MERS because they were fairly localized. We'll take H1N1 as one example that did go quite global. At one point, we say millions of people were infected. But what we saw initially is there was a lot of what we see right now, a high fatality rate in the first few days, travel restrictions, schools closing in Mexico, people staying home, factories shutting down and disrupted. With that, we saw the spread was very high, but we saw that the people who were getting sick were making a full recovery very quickly. In fact, the mortality rate was 0.02%. So very quickly, we saw people go back and things come back to normal. So the disruption was about 3 to 4 months for that one. That's probably the closest parallel. I don't want to go compare this to the Spanish flu, which had a fatality rate of 2.5%, because it's a very different time. It was a very different time then.
So another question I have from the audience is, we talked about high tech, but what about life sciences and biotech? How is this affecting them from your perspective and what we see from Resolink?
So from what our data shows with life science, biotech, and other similar industries is Italy. Once the outbreak hit Italy, we started to get very concerned. You see, everybody buys something from China, South Korea, and Japan, right? But Italy actually is a major hub there are CMOs there, contract manufacturers there, suppliers there. They have, final products that they export that are in the life science pharma. So they are part of the entire supply chain vertical for the industry. So definitely see that healthcare, biotech, and certainly healthcare. So the hospitals who are sort of tier 0 for that vertical will also see this affected.
That's great. Great insight. One additional question I have from the audience is, how does the Resolink offering, such as R-Score, help potential clients deal with risk events like this?
So what we've done is, because we are the supply chain mapping company of the world, what we do is we create metrics for suppliers that we we create metrics for every supplier that is sharing information on the platform. That metric is called R-Score. It's the resiliency score. And one of the things that the R-Score is made of 5 things. What is the supplier transparency? How transparent is the supplier? How much data are they sharing on the platform? How resilient is their network? How strong is their business continuity plan? How do their customers rate them? And then does the supplier have a maturity program where they're monitoring and mapping their own supply chains? So these 5 things make up the R-Score. And so what companies use R-Score to do is, without having to map their suppliers, they use R-Score to segment their suppliers and find out which suppliers are really critical suppliers where they need to go get deeper visibility, or work collaboratively with the supplier to improve their business continuity or their transparency, etc.
So I have another question. This is from our audience, and she's asking, for companies trying to keep inventory levels lean, do you recommend looking to increase from, say, 20 days to 2 or 3 months? And the second part of the question is, in doing so, this adds to the global shortage problem?
So our responsibilities as supply chain practitioners is to our company, our shareholders, and to ensuring that we protect revenue for our customers, right? So there is an inherent requirement there that we do what we can to get our supply lines going. We we look at, it's not black and white, and I understand that, so take what I say with a grain of salt. Apply your own industry, your own, there are people in supply chain who are making decisions that could save lives, right? So there are many considerations. I will just apply a generic response to this, which is we have a responsibility to our customers, to our boards and our investors, and that is to protect continuity of supply. A lot of times people do panic buying without getting the full picture. See, this is why mapping really helps you identify, should I do a risk buy on this item? And you don't need to do a risk buy on that item if 20 other items are also disrupted, right? So you have to get the full picture. And if it takes you 6 weeks to get the full picture, then the inventory is already gone by then. So mapping allows you to get to that answer very quickly. But if you have your part site mapping, you tie that to your inventory picture and you say, out of my 50 parts, these are the only 3 parts left that I don't have enough supply to cover my 3 or 6 month demand, and you go get that much for those 3 parts. But in the absence of mapping data, you're going to do exactly what you've suggested, which is you could end up going and buying massive risk buys and then do create a shortage for other critical applications that might be there.
So, Bindya, this first of all, we'd like to thank our audience for participating. This will be our last question. I know we're running to the top of the hour. We're getting a lot of questions, but what we'll do is we'll send you the questions offline, Bindya, so you can respond directly to the individuals who are asking these questions. But our last question is, we hear a lot of high-tech and non-high-tech companies requesting or mandating work from home. How does this affect or impact the business environment? Supply chain.
So think about, we have done this in the past with certain functions where we look at our application, our tools, our people, and we sort of map out what are all the people necessary in order for me to book revenue, right? So we have to make the order flows all the way to product getting shipped, to getting recognized, to the transaction getting logged, to me making revenue. So if you're in that order flow, that critical path of the order being received to order getting shipped, payment being received, then you have to assess how much of your role can be performed remotely. If you're working on the loading dock, obviously you have to be there in order for product to be shipped. So you might be one of those critical people who can't work from home. But if you're working in applications and logging transactions or accounts payables or receivables, then yeah, you probably can work from home and log in remotely. So it isn't a general answer. I would hate to answer generally, but I will say it depends on the role. And yes, it can be very disruptive if you are part of that critical workflow that goes from receiving an order to recognizing revenue.
So we'd like to thank the audience and especially Bindya Vakil for participating with us and giving all this great insight. Again, we will send out the presentation after the call, as well as we'll submit all the questions that weren't answered to Bindya for post response. So again, thank you everybody for participating in our second conference call for coronavirus.
Thank you.